Next up, we're thrilled to introduce Nnamdi Iregbulem, a passionate technologist and partner at Lightspeed Venture Partners, focusing on software investment across developer tools, application infrastructure, and machine learning. He's here to speak on the state of Black software development and his findings in representation, career progression, and compensation. We're so inspired by Nnamdi and can't wait to dig into his presentation. Enjoy.
Hey there, my name is Nnamdi Iregbulem. I'm a partner at Lightspeed Venture Partners, and this is the state of Black software development. So just a little bit about me before I go on. As I mentioned, I'm a partner at Lightspeed Venture Partners, where I focus on investments, specifically in some of the software investments, specifically in some of the nerdier aspects of software. So developer tools, application infrastructure, and data science and machine learning applications. Prior to Lightspeed, I did a brief stint in product at Confluent. And prior to that, I was an investor at Iconic Capital, where I invested in a set of amazing technically oriented companies, such as GitLab, no irony there, but also companies like Fastly, which is the next generation content delivery network, Alteryx, which is a data analytics and data preparation tool, and Epic Games, which is behind Fortnite, as well as the Unreal Engine. And I'm also a Yale and Stanford alum. And when I'm not investing in startups or advising founders, I write code, I tweet, although very, very sparingly. I take nerdy classes like Stanford's natural language processing, computer vision, deep learning courses. I write long form essays and articles about the economics of software development. And every once in a while, one of those posts hits the top of Hacker News, which is great. Like my post from a few months ago about how remote software developers actually earn more than non-remote developers. And my journey into software development is, actually probably not that much different than most of the folks watching this. Like many of you, I was self-taught, self-driven to learn how to program. I used to build websites using HTML and CSS and a little bit of PHP as a kid. Used to make money with those websites. I used to build desktop computers. I still build desktop computers. And growing up, I was always one of the few folks that was super interested in this stuff, and definitely the only Black person I knew who was really interested in this stuff. I was the only Black person in my AP computer science class, and so on. In college, my on-campus job was basically to help people fix their computers, which was great. And I continued to take more computer science classes there. But again, I was, one of few Black students, typically no more than two. More recently, I picked up Python 4 or 5 years ago and dove headfirst into machine learning and specifically deep learning. I come back home from my day job as an investor and dive into Python tutorials and projects until about 2 or 3 a.m., which is not a great way to get a lot of sleep. But I think my favorite project was a NLP classifier for sorting my emails into the right folder based off of their subject, which was kind of cool. And throughout my journey, I've always wondered why there weren't more Black individuals involved in software development. Why I was one of few. There's all this talk about diversity, right? Especially right now. The big tech companies release their annual diversity reports. There's some headlines about it, and then that's about it. And the reports themselves are often very high level, very opaque. And the underlying data is not itself open source. And so I thought that I could do better, or at a minimum, at least put some of these data science skills to use and hopefully add something valuable to the conversation by diving just a layer deeper. And this presentation is an attempt to do just that. And so this presentation fundamentally combines two perspectives, two lenses. The first is a quantitative look at various aspects of the Black software development experience. And to do this, I leverage the only reasonably detailed, large and publicly available data set that I know of, which is Stack Overflow's annual survey of software developers. This survey collects all sorts of interesting information, including earnings data, race, gender, what programming languages you know, the size of your organization, your role, etc. And my analysis combines the 2019 and 2020 results for enhanced statistical precision. And for the record, only includes US-based adult software developers working at least 20 hours per week on software development. And I want to caveat a few things here. This is an open survey. Anyone could take this survey. It's not a meticulously gathered Gallup poll, and so there's no guarantee that it's representative. And honestly, there's no guarantee that Gallup polls are representative either, but that's another topic. Additionally, anything other than the kind of raw data itself is my own analysis with all sorts of data prep and data cleansing. And so if you take issue with anything in this presentation, please come to me. Don't go to Stack Overflow. And because I knew that not everybody likes looking at pretty charts all day like I do, and because certain things are just not quantified anywhere, I've also included a more qualitative look at the Black software development experience. I interviewed a number of Black engineers, Black software founders, Black software investors to gather and share their perspectives. These are necessarily anecdotal and specific to these individuals. None claims to speak for the entire Black experience. And as came up in many of these conversations, the Black experience is not a monolith. But seriously, though, please do keep in mind that everyone has had a different experience in all sorts of ways. Before I go on to the main part of the presentation, I should mention that this analysis is completely open source. So all the Python code and a little bit of R, statistical models, the charts are all available in this Git repo you see on the screen. So if you want to replicate this analysis, if you want to change something about it, or you just simply want to understand it better, please feel free to clone the repo and be sure to start when you do. All right, so that's enough preamble. Let's get to it. The first topic of three that I'll cover today is representation, specifically Black representation within software engineering. And while it's hard to summarize everything that was shared in the interviews that I conducted, there were definitely some commonalities that came up. This notion of being one of few that I mentioned earlier, for example, this is tough for many people. It's tough both because it can be isolating, but also tough because it's hard to know whether the things you are experiencing are solely your own experience or representative of a broader group experience. If you think marketing attribution is tough, try to do it when it comes to race-related issues. It's really tough. Network-based hiring, which is so common in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, referrals, and all the rest. These sorts of hiring practices make it difficult to achieve appropriate representation, if those closest nodes within the network are themselves not very diverse. And so if I had to pick one quote that I thought nicely summarized the problem, it was from a software engineer at a startup who noted that companies often don't have to go outside their network to be very successful, and therefore have very little incentive to do so. All right, now for some data. So if you've been paying any attention to this topic, the following slide should not be too surprising to you, although it is still quite striking. And so in my data set, 2.4% of software developers are Black. This compares to roughly 5 to 7% of technology workers overall, and about 13% of the overall US population that is Black. And so you can say that Black software developers are roughly 2 to 3x underrepresented relative to Black technology workers, and then about 5x underrepresented relative to the overall US population. Interestingly, though, going back to my point that the Black experience is definitely not a monolith, what we can see is it is very different Black representation across genders. And so again, in my data set, as many as 6% of female software developers are actually Black, versus only 3.5% of those who identify as non-binary and 1.9% of men. And I don't necessarily have a hypothesis for why this is. It's completely possible that my data is not representative of real life, but this is something interesting and worth looking further into. Another thing that we can look at is representation by role. And here as well, we see a wide spectrum. The roles with the highest Black representation were educators, mobile developers, designers, and front-end folks. The roles with the lowest representation were academic researchers, ironically, DevOps, product managers, and data scientists. Very, very interesting. So now I want to move on to my next section, which is career progression. And if you think that network-based hiring can be somewhat problematic when recruiting at the individual contributor level, there's only more of a potential issue when recruiting senior leaders because the network of trust, the network of people considered for these roles is even tighter, even smaller, even more homogenous typically. And so, some of these things are subtle, right? It can be, it can be that it's harder to find mentors or sponsors within an organization who can advocate for you. It can be harder to develop the confidence that is expected of a senior leader when you're dealing with, all sorts of other hurdles. These are the sorts of things that came up in my conversations. And if I had to pick one quote, it would be from a senior leader who said, the opportunities given to you are based on trust. Who is willing to bet on you even before you've demonstrated that you can do it? This is harder for a Black person to pull off. And by the way, keep that theme in mind because I'm going to return to that in a few minutes. All right, so one of the simplest metrics of progression is years of professional experience. All right, so how many years you've been writing code for professional purposes. The reason this is important is that in any model of the career life cycle of a software developer, years of experience is going to be the dominant driver of earnings, especially early on in one's career where raises and promotions are relatively frequent. And so in those first 5 to 10 years, a single year of professional experience is actually quite valuable. And so what I've done here in the lower left, you can, in the lower left, I plotted the distribution of professional experience across both Black and non-Black developers using what's called a kernel density estimate. And if you don't know what that is, it's fine. Just think of it as a smooth histogram. And if you don't know what a histogram is, then we're going to have problems because it doesn't get any easier from here. But anyways, if you look at the purple distribution, which is for Black developers, what you can see is that it's as if the entire distribution of professional experience is sort of smushed to the left. And I know it's a very technical term there, smush, but seriously, it's as if the whole distribution was sort of shifted to the left by a bit. And how much is it shifted to the left? Well, about 2 to 2.5 years, which you can see on the right, where I've calculated the average and median earnings of, average and median years of professional coding experience for both Blacks and non-Blacks. And so now you might be asking yourself, what's causing this difference? And there's really two major hypotheses out there that I want to highlight. One is that the industry is diversifying, and that diversification is happening at the most junior ranks, because naturally, when someone joins software development industry and they haven't been in it before, they of course start with 0 years of experience, right? That's the left side of that distribution. And so if more Black professionals are becoming software developers, it's not entirely surprising that they would show up on that left side. The other explanation is sort of differential retention, by which I mean Black software developers being retained at worse, as in lower rates than others, which would cause a thinning of the ranks, so to speak, at the highest levels of software development. And there's actually evidence for both. And so what I plotted here is the Black representation within various experience levels. And so I've bucketed developers into 5-year experience buckets, 0 to 5 years of experience, 5 to 10 years of experience, and so on, all the way up. And within each, showing the percentage of developers in that bucket who are Black. And what we see is that aligning with the idea that the industry is diversifying from the bottom up, representation is significantly higher among those with less than 5 years of experience than in any other bucket. And then there's a meaningful fall off after 5 years of experience, and it continues to kind of fall from there, perhaps suggesting the retention hypothesis. Now, because this data is really a sort of snapshot in time and doesn't track a particular individuals over time, we can't actually determine which of these competing hypotheses is the bigger driver. It's not actually determinable from this kind of data. This is the sort of thing that a big technology company that tracks its employees over time could do, but it's not something that I can do with the tools and data that I have here. Another area I looked at was leadership. And here I define a leader as someone in the data set who claim to either be a manager or an executive within their organization. Here again, we find interesting differences. So with only 6.8% of Black software engineers characterizing themselves as leaders versus 8.5% of non-Blacks. And while it's interesting on its own, it is a bit coarse, right? Leadership, as I've defined it here, is effectively a binary or a Boolean variable. You're either a leader or you aren't. It doesn't really let us track how leadership opportunities are being doled out across the spectrum of, let's call it leadership potential, right? And so some people aren't leaders today, but are more or less qualified for leadership than other non-leaders. And within leadership, some folks are more or less qualified for it. Leadership itself, leadership potential itself is a complex combination of a number of different traits. It's not just about years of experience, it's also about many other things as well. Luckily though, because of the richness of this data set, I was able to take a crack at this. And so here is where machine learning comes to the rescue. And so what I was able to do is take all the different variables and features that I have in this data set, okay, other than race itself, and use that to predict one's likelihood of being a leader. And so what this does is it assigns effectively a leadership score to each survey respondent, reflecting that complex combination of traits that correlates with being a software engineering leader. I then bucket these scores into 5 quintiles, so the bottom 20%, the 20th to 40th percentile, and so on up until the top 20%. And then compare within each of these buckets what proportion of individuals were in fact leaders. And what we see is that in every bucket, aside from the top 20% of software developers, Black software developers that are roughly equally qualified for leadership are less likely to actually be leaders. And so, for example, in the bottom scoring 20%, 0.7% of non-Blacks leaders versus exactly 0 of Blacks. There's roughly parity in the second bucket. In the middle 20%, we see a gap. And then similarly in the fourth bucket, representing the 60th to 80th percentile. So, why is it important that among less qualified individuals, Blacks have fewer leadership roles? Well, the reason it's important is that oftentimes the first leadership opportunity that one receives is actually one you aren't totally qualified for, right? Someone likes you, they appreciate your work, and they decide to take a shot on you, take a chance on you. And this came up over and over in my interviews. And now we can finally quantify this idea that organizations are less willing to take a chance on Black software professionals until they are overqualified, right? Which would effectively be that fifth bucket on the slide. All right, and so for the grand finale, I want to talk about compensation. And again, it's hard to summarize in a few words the experience of so many different individuals, but there are definitely some key themes. Black professionals often don't have individuals in their immediate vicinity or network telling them how to advocate for themselves. People who have their best interests at heart, driving home the importance of negotiation on, say, compensation. Oftentimes, people don't even know what to ask or that they should even ask at all. It was very common for people to say, has anyone ever, looked me right in the eye and paid me less because of my race? Not necessarily, but have I felt unable or under-equipped to advocate for myself? Almost certainly. And so this ends up having a sort of indirect effect on compensation that is important to know. And I think my favorite quote on this was from a senior software engineering executive who told a story of how he missed a pretty big pay opportunity early in his career, saying that he identified another individual who was making 10% less than, and despite the fact that he was doing more work than this person, was doing better work than this person, and while he was eventually later in his career able to rectify this, at the time he felt under-equipped to advocate for himself professionally. All right, so the pay gap. Let me walk through this. So in dark blue, I have the what I'm calling the raw or unadjusted pay gap. So this is the differential that's typically referred to when people talk about pay gaps. It simply compares the average hourly earnings of Black and non-Black software developers, which yields a pay gap of about 7%. Or said another way, 93 cents for every Black developer earned for every dollar that a non-Black engineer earns. And then below that in purple, I have what I'm calling the adjusted pay gap. And by adjusted, I mean this controls for all the same factors I controlled for when coming up with the leadership score from before. So years of experience, title, age, education, programming languages that you know, etc. And taking these variables into account, the gap closes meaningfully to about 1% or so. And if you're wondering, it is that years of experience variable from before that is really doing most of the work here. I should say though, and you always have to caveat when talking about this kind of data, is that this does not necessarily definitively imply that discrimination isn't playing a significant role. For example, if discrimination is impacting the ability of Black software engineers to rise within their organizations, and I'm controlling for title, which is affected by some of these, potentially affected by discrimination, then that might obfuscate that and lead us to draw some incorrect conclusions. So just keep that in mind. And so just to wrap up compensation, what I've done here is effectively plot the raw pay gap at multiple percentiles along the earnings distribution. And what you can see here is that the raw pay gap is fairly consistent across the earnings distribution, at roughly 6 or so percent with some minor fluctuation. However, at the highest end of the distribution, the pay gap actually grows, reaching 11% at the 90th percentile of earnings. And you can't see it here, but if you were to extend this to the 95th or 99th percentile, the gap is actually closer to 13% there. It's definitely something worth looking into further. All right, so I know that was a ton of information, a ton of charts. I thought that I would just leave you all with some of the key takeaways that I gathered from this. I think on the representation point, clearly representation among Black software developers remains, representation of Black developers amongst all developers remains low. However, there is significant variation across probably all sorts of traits, but at least in here, gender and role. And I have an intuition that examining some of these areas where you see this variation might yield valuable insights for encouraging further diversification of the industry. On the career progression point, the industry does appear to be diversifying from the bottom up, but the retention point I think is also worth exploring further. And I want to emphasize this point around Black software engineers not receiving the same leadership opportunities early in mid-career, which has all sorts of knock-on effects later on. And then lastly, on compensation, indirect effects are arguably as important as direct. There's sort of a guidance gap that drives some of your earnings gap, right? Not having people in your network to guide you towards what you should be getting paid, and ensuring that you're getting paid what you're worth. And as I noted in the previous slide, we're seeing the largest gaps at the highest end of the earnings distribution and pretty consistent gaps across the rest. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching my talk on the state of Black software development. Do feel free to reach out to me or read more of my work in any of these venues. And as I mentioned earlier, this entire analysis is open source, so feel free to clone the repo and mess around with the data yourself. Thank you very much.